Yesterday, I saw a video from TGS anime where they talked about the anime censorship differences between, the Japan Yu-Gi-Oh and the US Yu-Gi-Oh. And I thought they did a decent job on, explaining why there were differences and everything, why certain things were changed and edited, if not cut out. And I don't blame them for kind of looking at certain things that were unnecessarily cut out or edited, because it kind of felt a little ridiculous and everything. Okay, he talks about this one scene where the Zork-possessed Bakura is eating a steak in Season 2's Battle City arc. And he talks about the fact that this was something that was unnecessarily cut, and, for why? Well, because of the dialogue mentioning, having Bakura or Zork Bakura mentioning that the steak needs more blood or something. Was that the reason? I mean, for anybody that's followed anime that gets dubbed over here to the U.S., we know that could get changed. We know that, they could change that line up and keep the scene in. But they didn't do that. They didn't do that or anything. And now other parts as well. There's other things that he mentioned that felt a little ridiculous and everything, when you get down to it. And I don't blame him for pointing that out. But there's other reasons why scenes like the, Bakura eating the steak kind of were cut, and that was because of time. He also pointed out that the reason things were changed, like the cards being different looking in the show compared to, let's say, in a movie, is because when you have them in a movie, you don't have to, you don't have to bow down, or you don't have to, I wouldn't say negate, but you don't have to basically please the FCC, because that's what it is. The FCC is the ones that said, hey, you're going to bring these over here, you got to change these cards up, because if you don't, that's just showing advertisements, in your show. And one of the things they made, perfectly clear for decades is they don't want advertisements in kids shows, whether they're brought over from another country or not. So changing them up to make them look like what they did in the original show and did in future shows, that's all because of the FCC. But when it comes to the movies, you're wondering why there's a difference. The difference is the movies don't adhere to the rules of the FCC like television does. But but here's the thing: when it comes to censorship between all these shows, when they come from Japan and they come over to the U.S., nowadays you wonder, why is there even censorship, period, if we know websites like Crunchyroll or Netflix, or not websites, but streaming services like Crunchyroll and Netflix are going to pretty much put the uncut versions, on the air. Even Hulu has done that. Hulu has done that with Sonic X, and they've done it with Yu-Gi-Oh, I think, or getting ready to do it with Yu-Gi-Oh. It's like, what's the reasoning for keeping them edited if there's going to be streaming services out there that are going to port over the originals? What's the reasoning? There is no reasoning. But at the time, though, there was no other way to bring the show over unless you altered it, from what it was. Now, here's the positive, though, the silver lining, because I used to own some of these. Back in the day, when the first season of Yu-Gi-Oh was out and everything, when the first season of Yu-Gi-Oh was out, on physical media of VHS and DVD, mostly DVD, Funimation, who was the original distributor, decided to port over the original Japanese version and redub it with the original English cast. The one that were doing the original the English dub series on weekday afternoons and Saturday mornings. They had them come in and redo the episodes, but read off the scripts that were translated from the original Japanese scripts. So that way we can get an English uncut version of the episodes intended as they were meant to be seen. They did that for a while and then they stopped doing it. Why? I don't know. I'm thinking maybe because young kids, because one thing he did point out in this video is that the reason for the changes is that the Yu-Gi-Oh! Brought over here was intended for a younger audience, while the Yu-Gi-Oh! In Japan, which is more shonen based, was meant for the teenage audience, like 13 to 18 to 20 years old. And that's true because you could definitely tell the difference, not just in dialogue, but also in presentation. You could see that. So when it was brought over here, just like with shows like One Piece, and several others, they had to be edited down in a massive, massive way to be suitable for young children. I mean, this is why One Piece didn't last too long, if you will, on the 4Kids Saturday mornings, or the Vortex Saturday mornings, or even for a brief period, KidsWB. This is why One Piece didn't last too long. This is why it didn't last too long, mainly because of the fact that it took too much effort. I'm assuming too much effort and everything to not only dub over the episode's original scripts to be more suitable, but also edit it out and censor all the scenery in that series. Yeah, that's why One Piece didn't last too long, because unlike Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon and a few other anime that came afterwards, there was just too much for it to be edited or dubbed over, because One Piece was meant for an older audience. You could see that, in the movies they've done. You could see that even in the series they're doing today. It's meant for an older audience. So for them to try to port that over when it became popular, that was not probably the best idea for them to do, because that took more effort to basically have to change up and make more suitable for Saturday mornings, which is why it didn't last long. So, getting back to the whole Yu-Gi-Oh! Thing, the reason they changed things up the way they did was mainly they were making it more suitable for kids, and it was a little bit more easier, because they had to go and, they had to basically get it past the FCC regulations. That's why they had to do it. My mouth hit the mic there, I do apologize. But they had to get it past the regulations by the FCC. They had to do that. And the best way for them to do that, basically, was to, not only take certain scenes out, or alter them or edit them, change things up to where it was more child-friendly, more old-school Saturday morning presentation. But they also did it. But they also basically did it with, like I say, the presentation of the cards and everything. So that way you're not advertising. And also, yes, there was darkness. I mean, season 2, the last season, Waking the Dragon season. A lot of these seasons were dark in their own manner, were dark in their own way, don't get me wrong. But they were easier to edit. They were easier to say, okay, season 5, we're not going to show in a flashback, people from Bakura's village getting thrown into a pot and being melted down and everything for the souls and all that, or whatever, or being killed by being melted down. No, instead it's like, just take the evil souls and toss them into the Shadow Realm, or whatever. And it's like, that's much more easier, I guess, to digest. Than it would be for them to think, for kids, I should say, to digest, than for, I guess, in their minds, kids to basically, for kids to basically see, people, even in silhouette, getting melted down into a liquid, if you will, getting melted down into a liquid in a smelting pot, if you will. So, when you compare a lot of the animes that were ported over, basically from Japan, Yu-Gi-Oh!, along with the likes of Pokemon, Sonic X, and a few others, were easier to edit and dub over, and make more presentable than the likes of a One Piece. But even as Yu-Gi-Oh! The original series, the first full-length series, got towards its end and everything, got towards its end, basically, it got pretty dark. You could see that. It got pretty dark. And it got to a point that certain things had to be altered, just to make it suitable. Even the final arc of the final season, they had to do whatever it took to make it more presentable. And it's like, okay, that's fine. It's like, okay, that's fine. That you got to do that. But, give some fans some compensation that have been online. Because by that time, when we got to the final season here in the States, we already had websites dedicated to showing the comparison differences between all the seasons. So it's like, if there's websites out there, and I'm sure they did, that were showing comparisons, then why not strike a deal, maybe let's say Cartoon Network, Toonami, which is out at that time, for a late night presentation of the uncut version, and even in Japanese language. Why not just do that? It would have been easier to do, but they didn't do that. It would take people like me to download certain episodes to see the difference, between the American version and the Japanese version. So yeah, even when we had the dark elements, like I said, in season 2, in the final half of that, we saw the dark parts in Raking the Dragons, and as well as we saw the very dark season 5. It's like, okay, we understand why they did it, but at least give us some compensation. At least let us know, hey, if you want to watch the uncensored version, we recommend going here or something like that. But yeah, I do agree that, it had to be done. As much as we don't like seeing it, looking at it now, as much as we don't like the idea that things had to be censored, it's all because of the FCC. The FCC for decades has always wanted to make sure that if you're going to put a show out there, one, you need to make sure it doesn't have no advertisements in the show. You got to make sure that doesn't happen. And secondly, you also got to make sure that it has some kind of lesson in there. And believe it or not, even though it's very subtle, Yu-Gi-Oh! Did have lessons, morals in there. Even the ones that came afterwards had the same thing. Sonic X had it, Pokemon had it. Hell, they even attempted it with One Piece, but that didn't work, like I said. So, in the end, again, I appreciate what TGS Anime did with this video. I appreciate that they pointed out all these facts, and I recommend you guys go watch it. I'll probably link it here at the end. But, obviously, obviously, in closing, when we look at the censorship deal, if there's one lesson I think we, as the viewers, and those that tried to censor certain shows here that make them suitable for here in the U.S., the one lesson I think we've all learned is there are animes you can do it with, even though it's going to take a lot of effort, and there are some animes you can't do it with. And like I said, Yu-Gi-Oh!, especially as it got a little darker towards the end, yeah, it was probably a lot harder for them to, edit and, redub and, switch up, cut certain things out and all that. Sonic X did that too, especially in the 3rd season. There's an episode when Sonic X where Knuckles is taking on one of the Metarex generals, and his mecha suit shatters, and we see that he's actually just like Cosmo. He's a plant monster, right? He's just eating, whatever you want to call it. And in the original, he falls off a cliff, and instead of, taking Knuckles' hand to be helped up, he just lets himself slide into the lava and, submerge under there, sink under there, and burn and die. Well, in the dubbed version, that part's cut out. Like, we see him sliding down, but we don't see the result. Thus, you're cutting out, like, a minute or two of scenery to get that full scope. And they even do it at the beginning of some episodes. Like, you have the characters at a bar drinking like beer or wine. They cut that out. So there are situations. There are situations to where even, an anime like Sonic X had to have things cut out unnecessarily when you could have just, changed it up and everything. you could have had it changed up. Like if you didn't want that one, character that Knuckles beat, to be seen going into lava, change it up to a water or some kind of a mud or something like that, some kind of vortex maybe, and he gets sucked in there. That's more presentable, more reasonable, if you understand what I'm saying. But yeah, the later the show got in seasons, obviously, the more darker it would get, based on the story. The darker it would get. I mean, I'm surprised that, Sonic X and some of the flashback stories towards the end of the final season, they did get a little, surprisingly dark. I was kind of surprised 4Kids allowed certain things to be kept in there. Like in the flashback, we see one character, turn into the dinosaur-like monster to protect his family, but it's so much for him that it kills him. And you kind of do see, a little bit of blood out of his chin, and it's like, okay, I didn't expect that. So there are some things that they can get away with, because it's not that bad. And it does, and basically in story, it does kind of, add to the, to the arc, to the character, to the overall story arc that they're telling. And so sometimes you can cut it out, but you can alter it dialogue-wise, but you can't cut it out, if that makes any sense. But yeah, like I said, when shows later on when shows would get later on in seasons, there were times they'd get darker and it would be unavoidable. I mean, even TGS Anime mentioned that there were times, in the later seasons of Yu-Gi-Oh! That things had to be kept in because, they were necessary to the story and they were unavoidable. You had to keep them in. Basically, you had to keep them in to an extent, but I think change up the dialogue to kind of implement something else that's similar to what the original dialogue would refer to or was said. Basically, when shows, later on in the run, get a little darker, it gets harder to the point that you can try, but there are times you just got to keep it in there for reasons, and that's it. But it does kind of I will say this, it does kind of ruin the experience a little bit, because when you go online and you compare the dubbed version to the original Japanese version, and you see what was cut, you're like, well, why did they do this? Why this? This could have helped more. This could have helped explain this character's backstory and everything more. But again, it's the scenery, it's the reasoning, that they, decided to cut it out. Like when Raphael in the Awakening of Dragons arc, loses his family, there's a scene in a flashback where he's digging into a grave, and he pulls up two little skulls representing his brother and sister. And you look at that and you're thinking, well, okay, I can understand that, but you could have basically had it maybe he's digging and he sees two little things, little lights that represent his brother and sister and everything. You could have done that. True, you could have. But they didn't. They didn't do that, and instead they cut that scene out. So some things, understandably, can and have to be cut out because of, the difference in culture. But the point I'm getting at is as shows get later on in the run, it got a lot harder. And this is why, when I look at One Piece, why it didn't last so long on, on 4Kids and all that, because, obviously somebody probably noted that the later on they were getting on in the season, in that initial season, it got a lot more, I guess you could say, riskier and darker and bloodier. And more violent in a way. Sort of screw this, it's not worth it. Let's just put these out and be done with it. And that's what they did. That's what they did. So, overall, again, I appreciate what TGS Anime, said in this video. I highly recommend you guys check it out. Like I said, I'll put it at the end here so you guys could see it. But let me know what your thoughts are on the censorship when it comes to, a lot of shows that have come over from Japan to America, back then and even now. What are your thoughts on it? Do you think it's necessary anymore? Especially since we got sites like Netflix and Crunchyroll and all that don't really adhere to the FCC as much. Let me know what your thoughts are. Comment down below, like the video, ring the bell for notifications, subscribe to the channel, share the video, click on the links in the description to find my content elsewhere. You can find me at all your favorite audio and video podcast affiliates like iTunes, iHeartRadio, Pandora, Spotify, Audible from Amazon, Radio Public, Overcast. Anywhere there's a podcast, you will find mine there. You can also find me at VENMO at BWRoses, Rumble.com at BWRoses, Odyssey.com at BWRoses-5. You can also find me at DeviantArt.com at BVW1979. You can also find me at InkBunny.net at BWRoses. You can also find me at twitch.tv and kick.com. I also have a Patreon as well. You can find me there. And also, ladies and gentlemen, you can follow me at Twitter, aka x.com at BWRoses, TikTok at BWRoses, and Blue Sky at BWRoses. Also, I have a Venmo and Cash App if you want to help out there as well. But guys, give me your thoughts overall also, and check out the Teespring store too, I should say, for merchandise you can't get anywhere else. But again, guys, let me know what your thoughts are overall on the censorship deal. Again, check out TGS's Anime's video. I think you'll enjoy it. And until next time, I'm out.